Audacity in three, two, one.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're going to be busting some myths.
Yeah. Throwback to the days where literally every single Monday I would do a hashtag Mythbuster Monday post and bust common fitness myths. I mean, I feel like that was the first like regular trend thing that I ever did. Good days, good
Yeah, you
times.
were pretty consistent with it.
For a while, yeah, for a long time. I mean, and I think it was just like something that hit so well back in 2016. Like it was just like the best post because people were like, oh my God, this is awesome information. But now you have to put so much more thought into it. You know, you have to like get the right real audio and then record a visual that's going to be appealing and then also busts the myth in a way that's entertaining, you know?
I miss like 2015, 2016 Instagram so much, where
That
it
was
was like
nice.
like what was it? Mythbuster Monday. Or what was the other hashtag for Monday? Oh,
Uh,
Motivation Monday. What
Training
was
Tuesday or something
I don't
like
even
that.
remember when. I know it was Throwback Thursday.
Win
Like,
Wednesday.
yeah, I don't know. But it just having like, oh, this is all I need to post today. Or like, oh, I just need a photo. Like not having to like have like a graphic or oh, I haven't done a carousel in a while or oh, I need a reel. So yeah, just my little rant.
Yeah, it was an easier time for sure. Uh,
Yeah.
but I think podcasts are great because we can, and the thing about Reels, I was actually talking about this with someone recently, is that they do better the less nuance and detail that you include. Meaning that if I were to say, the opposite of one of these myths that we're going to bust today, and I were to say, that's just not true, that's going to do a lot better than if I'm like, well, see, here's the context, and here's how it depends, and here's how this works. But the thing I love about podcasting is that people listen for the nuance and the detail and the stories behind it and everything like that. So
Yeah,
long
yeah, I
form.
agree. I do like
Cool.
long form.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we thought that this would be a really good topic to touch on kind of, I mean, we already know it's what, 2, 3 weeks into January, but still I feel like it's a good refresh. Maybe you don't believe all of these things, but maybe there's one of them where you've still been like on the fence or kind of iffy about. So just
Yeah.
kind of like touching on common fitness myths that we hear all the time, like we see still on certain accounts. And
Yeah.
these are the things I wish were not around anymore.
Totally. Yeah. And I think just kind of on that note, the context of the industry, there's jokes that actually go around now that are pretty funny, but it's basically like, have you seen that one of those viral reels where someone's at the grocery store and they're trying to figure out what they should buy for their nutrition and they're scrolling on Instagram while they're at the store. And so they walk up to like the
Oh, yeah, yeah.
oatmeal and then it's the reel that's like the guy's like, oatmeal is bad. And it's like, oh, darn it. And he puts it back. And then he's like, buy the broccoli. And they're like, you can't eat broccoli. Broccoli is bad. And he puts the broccoli down. He goes, darn it. And like every single food item, there's somebody that's like, this is bad. You can't have this. Like, and it's exhausting. Like if you don't know where to get your information or who to trust, it could be really, I could imagine that it would be very overwhelming to get to the store and actually know what you need.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's, I mean, you and I get on a lot of phone calls with women who are like, I don't know what to eat. Like there's so much conflicting information. So
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, well, no wonder you're confused.
Yeah, exactly. And the reality is that like it's not because you're dumb. You're definitely not. And the reality is you probably know what things are generally healthy versus not, but the reason why it feels so clouded is because social media can be crazy nowadays. So if you're here, it means you want some good evidence-backed information, and we will not only talk about what the truth is of the matter, but also what the research says and where did these things even come from in the first place, which is what I love about myth busting, is figuring out like reverse engineering, why did this become a thing, and really being able to parse it out from there. So a big one is carbs before bed, carbs in general. Carbs are bad for you, and this whole low carb keto net carb movement that is around us nowadays. I feel like things have kind of shifted from that to more of like the grain-free, holistic, like hippie style stuff, but it's still pretty prevalent where people are trying to cut carbs or not have them at certain times of day, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the thing that you hear a lot is carbs after dark, right? It's like as soon
Mm-hmm.
as the sun starts to set, it's like, oh my God, I can't eat carbs after 6 p.m. And like the myth comes from like, okay, if I consume carbs in the evening, that's going to lead to weight gain because my body is not active and I'm not able to burn off the calories. Like that is the thought process. And to be fair, it's kind of like if you hear that, you're like, oh, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, oh, so I shouldn't
Yeah.
have carbs after dark. So like that one is something that I used to believe because again, like you hear that statement and you're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can like fall into these logic traps where it's like that's sounds like it makes sense. It could be true. And if you know like just a little bit about metabolism, like it could make sense. But of course, we have actually studied this and have seen the effects of what does that actually do. So there's actually a lot of research around the whole high carb, low carb thing because it's been such a big, like highly debated topic. And even with like really, really high carb diets, when calories are controlled for, and sometimes even when they're not, but when calories are especially controlled for, where it's like two groups, one's eating 2000, they're both eating 2000 calories, one's eating low carb, one's eating very, very high carb. When they're doing that consistently, one group versus the other, there's really not much of a significant difference between like the types of body composition changes or health marker changes that these people are having. Um, and time of day really comes into play where we argue like, okay, the time of day, your metabolism slows down before bed, et cetera, et cetera. But when you're controlling for calories, you are basically eliminating that from being a variable because every 24 hours, you're going to end up burning roughly the same amount, give or take a little bit based on activity. So you should end up just utilizing the fuel at some point, even if you don't utilize it right away in bed and your metabolism's not in a carb burning state at night. It doesn't mean that you're not using that fuel. It doesn't mean it's just going straight towards fat. It's more about the overall energy balance, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it's something to think about. Like your metabolism might be slightly slower when you're sleeping, but it doesn't shut off.
Yeah.
So it's not like so I don't want you to think that like oh, okay it's like yeah and like we do recommend like timing your carbs around your workouts to have more energy and more output but it's not because of like there's like a huge significant difference in your rate of metabolism. It's like more so just like fueling your workouts.
Yeah. Well, and here's where I think there's a little bit of validity to the rule itself, which is eating carbs late at night, eating foods that, and let's kind of like, what does that mean, right? So, like, if I were to eat a sweet potato late at night, this probably wouldn't apply. But what are the foods that we typically label as very high in carbohydrates? Typically we're not even labeling the right thing. We're labeling foods that are high in carbs and fats that are hyper palatable, that are highly processed as our carbs, when in reality, like Cheez Its, donuts, chips, like these are a combination of carbs and fats that are hyper palatable. But let's say we label those as the carbs and we eat them before bed. What's the actual danger of that? The actual danger of that is it's late at night, you had a long day, you're tired, your mental energy is not there. Your mental discipline, fortitude may not be there. So if you open a bag of chips while you're sitting on the couch, what might happen? You might keep reaching in because you have lower willpower later in the day. And that is something that you could get into a pretty slippery slope with some foods like that when we are closer to bedtime. I know that's just the case for me. I'm more tired at the end of the day. I know that willpower being limited is a myth, but I think that there's something to do with like mental sharpness and how much willpower we can exert in that moment that are probably correlated, if I had to guess.
Yeah, and the same could be said even if you were eating like chicken and broccoli at the end of the night. Like if you were to overeat, that'd be a lot of food to consume. But if you were to overeat, 4 or 5, let's say 1,000 calories, like it's, I don't want to say calories in, calories out. Like that's not the only thing that matters, but like the study that you brought up earlier, like you have to control for the intake. And so you could do the same thing essentially at the end of the night just by eating in more food than you normally would.
Yeah, it's just hard to eat a lot of chicken and broccoli because it could
Very
get
hard.
boring. But chips, you could easily surpass those calories for sure. By the way, the study that I referenced, there are a couple studies that compare, high carb, low carb, that sort of thing. Well, the example I gave is not specifically from any study. It was kind of just a generalization of what they did.
Right. Yeah,
I
yeah,
was like, because I am not at the point right now where I can remember the names of the authors and the years, and I used to be able to do that, and it's been a little bit.
yeah. Awesome. So at the end of the day, basically you just want a balanced approach to your meals and don't be afraid of consuming carbs after dark. You're going to be
Yeah.
okay.
Especially when it's like your schedule. I talked to someone recently who her schedule just only allows her to basically get home late at night after the kids' sports. And that's the only time she can have her last meal of the day, at like 9, 10 p.m. She's like, is that bad though? And I was like, well, I'd rather you do that than just completely undereat and worsen your metabolism in a different way, because it's really just if you're consistent with that and that is your day-to-day week-to-week routine where your last meal is at 9 or 10 p.m. Here's the other thing too. I think people, bodybuilders in particular, avoid eating late at night because they don't want to see the scale fluctuate from just having more like food weight in their stomach. Because like if I were to eat a big meal at midnight and wake up at 6 a.m. versus if I ate that same big meal at like 8 p.m. or 7 p.m. and wake up at 6 a.m., I'm gonna be heavier on the scale in the first scenario simply because there's more food in my stomach that has still not processed yet and been burned off as energy, not because it's body fat. And so if you have an irregular eating schedule and you happen to eat late at night one night, you may weigh in higher than normal the next day. But if that's just your everyday routine, then it'll just be your new baseline, and then your weight will trend the way it needs to trend from there if you continue to control for calories. So I think it's important to consider that too. It's like we want to have a reliable weigh in the morning, but not at the expense of our sanity or our ability to just eat our damn food.
Yeah. And I know that you and I have talked about this in previous podcasts where we have clients who have to work out first thing in the morning. And I'm talking like 4, 5 in the morning, and they don't want to get up, eat something, and they don't have time to like process everything. So we encourage them to have their pre-workout meal, which is typically a little bit higher in carbs at the end of the night as their final meal to serve them in the morning. So, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
And carbs specifically, and starchy carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates especially, trigger a release of serotonin from the brain, which
Hmm.
helps you actually get to sleep a little bit better. So if you've ever felt that kind of like drowsy feeling after having a really high carb meal, it's because it's supposed to make you sleepy. So in fact, having some carbs before bed could actually be very beneficial to your sleep as long as it's not so much food that you're uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
So,
We want to cover the anabolic window.
oh yeah. Yeah.
This is one of my favorites.
I remember when I was like 18 or 19, I first started all this stuff in Instagram. I remember making a video, I don't know if it was for YouTube or what, of like finishing my workout and pouring my protein shake right away and like vigorously chugging it down because I had to meet my anabolic window of getting my protein in right after I worked out. I can't remember where I posted that, but I remember it did very well back in the day.
I literally would bring chicken and I would eat that in the locker room, like
Oh,
immediately
wow.
following my workout. Yeah, but that was back in like 2015 when I had like that was just the protocols that my coach gave me is to eat within 30 minutes of my workout and
Nice.
I would eat chicken.
Nice. So yeah, the
But
anabolic window is theoretically the window of time after you have torn up your muscle fibers, done your strength training workout, that your body, or I guess any sort of workout really, but that your body is like going to hyper absorb the stuff that you eat because you have just like put it into a catabolic state where it wants to like soak up these nutrients and use them as much as possible. And the belief is that it's like a 30-minute window. If you miss it, you're totally screwed and you're not going to build muscle the same way that you otherwise would.
Yeah. And again, this is the whole idea. It's like logically, it makes sense, right? I have this like 30-minute to like an hour after exercise where I need to like enhance like protein synthesis and I need to like it's going to help me recover. And so it like again, it's one of those things where it kind of makes sense. So you're like, oh, so that's why I should do this. And like I would argue now that like if you're in like a really, really like heightened state, if you're just like still on that high and like your heart rate is beating really fast after your workout because you're still like processing pre-workout and you're to consume a meal, that might do actually more harm. Not, I don't know if more harm than good, but like it would probably make a little bit more sense for you to eat in like a more relaxed state where you're not rushing, where you're not eating chicken in your car on the way home, like because you're so
Yeah.
stressed about the anabolic window. It's like take your time, like get home and like sit and eat a meal when you can be a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like, yeah, like you said, it's just when you're in that post-workout state, it's logically I feel like makes sense because you probably feel the most like fatigue and pump at that time where it's like, oh, I can feel my muscles. It just got worked so hard. Let me refuel them. But yeah, like you said, just being able to pause for a second. So they did research on the anabolic window, and when I say they, I mean people who research exercise science and sports nutrition did research on the anabolic window, and it turns out that this period exists, but it's just way longer than we thought. So it's like 3 to 4 hours post workout. So the takeaway that you should probably have with this is just like don't skip eating for hours and hours and hours after training. And I think practically, if it's like a habit stack that works for you, like let's say it's just like easier if like when I work out, then I get this protein shake in or whatever. Like there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. I'm glad that it's helping you get that in. And in fact, for people who maybe struggle with getting their protein intake in, that's a great period where you could kind of chug a protein shake and not really feel too full from it a couple hours later because it is like I don't know about you, but I still feel like when I eat like right after my workout that like my body does just kind of like get it down and process it a little bit faster if it's like a light protein shake or something like that. And so it could kind of help you just like get your calories in, get your protein in a practical setting, but there's really no physiological benefit of like, oh my God, you're gonna get so many more gains from doing it this way.
Yeah, and like the studies have also shown that like your overall daily protein intake and the distribution
Yeah.
throughout the day is going to be way more significant than just like the immediate post-workout meal that you have. So
Yeah.
if you're so stressed about having this protein pre-workout or post-workout, but you're only consuming like 50 grams of protein a day, like that's not going to benefit you the same way if you had 100 to 130 grams of protein, but you spaced out evenly throughout the day. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Or
don't
like
freak out.
here's the debatable point, right? So another myth that's not listed in our list is that if you eat more than 30 grams of protein in a sitting, then your
Mm.
body's not going to use it. But that's also been disproven. And there's actually been research to show that if you eat your whole day's worth of protein in one sitting, then your body will still utilize it across those like 24 hours or whatever. And so like let's contrast this, like debate this instead. If you ate all of your protein intake in one sitting at the least optimal time compared to the anabolic window once per day, every day, or if you ate not enough protein, so you only ate 50 grams of protein a day, but you did that in that anabolic window, 30 grams, which is going to be better or worse for you, I would actually argue the former because you're getting in the total amount every 24 hours so that your body can utilize it. Is it the best thing ever? Is it great on your digestive system? No. But overall, it's going to result in more gains total because you're just not protein deprived.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we should have kind of like preference or just kind of say this at the end is like there's a really big difference between like what's optimal and then what's actually going to be realistic for you and your lifestyle and your factors. So like yeah, if you don't have time to like have a meal or anything and it's just convenient for you to have the post-workout shake, or if you have again all of your protein in one sitting because that's just for whatever reason that's what your schedule allows, it's like yeah, it may not be 100% optimal, but like
Yeah.
just what is realistic for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, that could be a tough pill for some people to swallow because we want to optimize everything and be perfect at everything, but then we actually look at how are we really doing, and it's not that great. So, um, absolutely. So that was another one, was you can't have more than 30 grams of protein in a sitting at a time. And to kind of complement that, it is best and it is optimal to space your protein intake evenly across the day. So if I have 100 grams of protein, for example, is my target, then spreading it across, 3 servings of 33 grams or 4 servings of 25 grams is going to do my body a little bit better in terms of muscle gain and retention than if I had all 101 serving. But that all 101 serving is still better than under eating the goal in total. So there's a hierarchy here. And I think that's just the important picture to paint.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. What was next? You said knees over
Y-
toes.
I think you said that.
Oh, maybe I did. But the myth is you can't let your knees cross over your toes in a back squat or a lunge pattern or anything where you are going into knee flexion. And this has also been disproven. I think the rationale was that it's going to hurt your knees. The rationale is that it puts a lot of stress on the knee joint, which is true, but stress is not always bad. And so that was the interesting part, right? It's like the most force is applied to the knee joint at those angles. But we took that and we said that's immediately bad. We should push our hips back more and keep our knees behind our toes. But what that actually does is makes us less resilient, makes our knees weaker, and then we're more prone to knee pain. What happens to these people that subscribe to that belief is then they have bad knees as a result of not training that range of motion. And then they have knee issues and they're more prone to believe that, oh my God, knees over toes is so bad, so bad, so bad. And to keep doing what I'm doing. And they're actually making it worse, which is pretty ironic and pretty funny. But I have only watched a little bit of the knees over toes guy stuff, but I actually really, really like him and his just kind of ethos methodology. Obviously, he's an extreme, like he's very passionate about what he does. So there's obviously got to take everything with a grain of salt. But I do like the ethos behind just like strengthening that range of motion as a whole and actually training it a little bit more if you have bad knees.
Yeah. And then that kind of like, oh, you should never have your knees over toes in like a movement like a squat. And so that doesn't take into consideration like any individual variability, right? So I
Yeah.
think that that's something that's like, again, when it comes to people who say you should never do this or you should always do like you, when they use those, um, what are those called?
Absolutes.
The absolutes. Yeah. It's like, you kind of like, is that true? Like, I'm sure that there's some variability for that. But yeah, so you want to take into consideration, like some people have more of like a forward knee position than others. Like some people have better like hip or ankle mobility. And that can
Yeah.
definitely influence the position of your knee during a squat. So something definitely to take into consideration, like if having your knees like more back, but that causes you more pain, it's like, well, maybe you shouldn't continue doing the movement that way. So just kind of like playing around with what feels best for you.
Yeah, and not under load, right? So like if you're gonna play
Yes.
around
Yeah.
with this shit, like don't do it under your 135-pound barbell or 225-pound barbell. Like that is how you get hurt. Like the gurus are right in that aspect. Go body weight and like test it out. And that's something that I've been doing recently is like I'll warm up with kind of like a I think they're called ATG lunges is what his thing is, but it's essentially you're just doing a lunge where you like completely flex your knee forward as much as possible and it looks like the wrong way to lunge essentially. but you're just training your quads and your knees to get comfortable, like going through that range of motion. I just do a body weight, right? And I'm an advanced trainee. I could push a lot of weight with my legs, but I personally have like really shitty ankle mobility and a really like poor ability to put my knees over my toes, and my knees aren't great. So that's actually helped a lot with like the clicking and the clacking of my knees whenever I do stuff.
Yeah, well, that's good. But yeah, I think that's really important, not under load, to just
Yeah.
play around with like your foot placement, like your knee placement, and then also taking into consideration like the exercise that you're doing, right? Like
Mhm.
you might feel better doing something one way with a lunge than you do with the squat, or like if you do a high bar squat or a low bar, like all of those different things can factor into your biomechanics and how you're performing that exercise.
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, yeah, I think just your warning as a whole of like, is somebody speaking in complete absolutes is really important here, right? So you should never, you should always is typically a warning flag. I just can't think of a situation where I think always and never are truly warranted. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
All
And then
right,
the next one, fasted cardio.
yeah. Yeah. So fasted cardio is basically this notion that you should perform cardio in a fasted state. So typically this is in the morning, before eating. And then there's a lot of nuances before, like, is it before coffee? Is it before aminos? Is it before this? Typically it's before consuming anything that kind of like alters your, would you say your metabolism or like your blood sugar? So the
Yeah.
idea that like in the absence of recently consumed carbs, like your body is going to rely more on stored fat for energy. So therefore, if you
Mhm.
do fasted cardio, you're going to burn more fat.
Yeah. So I actually remember this from the lab that I worked at for about a year or so. So part of what we did was VO2 max testing. And so this is when you put on a mask and you're breathing into a tube while you're running uphill on a treadmill at increasing degrees of difficulty until you can't. And what the VO2 max test does and what some of the reports show is what where does your metabolism shift from fat burning to carb burning, and at what point of intensity is that, and what kind of state is your metabolism in. And we also would do that with resting metabolic rate testing, where they'd lay flat on the table, breathe into a tube for 20 minutes, and we'd get numbers that represent what metabolites they are primarily burning at rest and at certain intensities of exercise. And so generally for most people, a healthy metabolism will metabolize fat either stored or eaten, but will typically metabolize fat more in fasted states and in low intensity states. So, fasted cardio, the myth is essentially like, well, if I want to burn as much fat as possible, then what I need to do is do cardio when I'm fasted and do low intensity cardio instead of high, because then I'll burn the most fat possible. But the difference here is that fat oxidation, like physically burning fat molecules, is very different than fat loss on your body. Like just because you're burning that metabolite doesn't necessarily mean that like you're actually like shrinking down your body fat stores in that way. In fact, there's been kind of counter studies to show that if you do that fasted cardio or you burn, intentionally burn more of those calories in that fat burning zone on purpose, that your body kind of will compensate the rest of the day to do the opposite and kind of just,
Mm,
make up for what wasn't burned from carbs. But in general, a healthy metabolism will kind of switch into carb burning either when you eat or when you go up in intensity in your workout. Now, unhealthy metabolisms, basically like metabolic syndrome, is never being able to like pull from stored fat and just be always being in that carb burning zone. But if you're metabolically flexible, you're able to do that. So essentially, that's kind of where it comes from, is like, again, logically, it makes sense because you're literally burning more molecules of fat in those states. However, that's just too far of a logical jump when you actually look at the full 24-hour cycle and what your body is doing as a whole over the course of time, say in a calorie deficit or like with your fat loss results as a whole.
Yeah, I haven't heard that, which I think is really interesting. Your body's so smart.
Yeah.
It's like I hear what you're trying to do. However, we're going to do the opposite the rest of the day. But the
Yeah.
other thing to think about too, it's like if you, again, if you are someone who has to like do cardio before work and you're having to get up at like the crack of dawn and you're trying to do, you know, your cardio at like 4 in the morning and you are just like dragging ass, well, like that probably isn't going to be as effective session as if
Yeah.
you just did it later in the day when you're fed and you have you're gonna have better performance, right? Like you're more clear, like you have that energy, and you could get more output from that session just doing it later in the day. So just like
Totally.
kind of completely negates the idea of like fasted cardio.
Yeah, I think it's really asking yourself like what is the purpose of this? If my goal is to accelerate my fat loss progress as much as possible, I would argue that it makes more sense to do like higher intensity metabolic conditioning or like just higher moderate intensity cardio rather than low intensity cardio because you're just going to get more calories burnt out of it. And that's really the goal is total net energy balance. It is to an extent calories in versus calories out still that principle still the principle still works. That is still how people lose body mass and body fat. And so if you can, like Christina said, be more productive with that session with some food in your system and say get a really high intensity workout in, maybe do some HIIT intervals, which actually I learned over this weekend that HIIT is undoing its bad rap lately and it's getting more popular and
Mm,
it's actually not supposedly not as detrimental for us as we once thought in terms of recovery and being able
hmm,
to do it frequently. So
interesting.
yeah, I may start leaning towards recommending a little bit more, short burst, high intensity, shorter sessions, get the most bang for your buck, get in, get out, and have the best fat loss results that way. So yeah, carbs or fed or not fed, doesn't matter. Like as long as you can perform.
Yeah, and this is not to say again, if you are one of those people who you're like, well, the only time I have to do cardio is when I get
Yeah,
up in the
you're
morning,
great.
so is this bad? No, not at all. And so one of the things that you can consider is having like EAAs or like BCAAs while you're doing cardio, like something to sip on,
Yeah.
whether it's like Gatorade powder or even like a protein shake or something, just to have something in your system. Because I know that like muscle catabolism, like the breakdown of your muscles, is like that's something that a lot of people are like, "Ooh, we probably shouldn't do fasted cardio because of that."
Mhm.
But that also just might lead to also just having some additional energy in your system. So again, leading to
Yeah.
higher output.
Or if it's just mental. For me, it's literally just mental. If I'm like drinking something that feels like it has calories, then I will automatically do better than than if I'm not. There's actually been studies to show that. I do know those ones pretty well, where they gave people like placebo calorie, like a placebo milkshake essentially, where it was like one milkshake was actually 1,000 calories and the other one was like a low calorie one, and they based on what they were told it was had more of an impact on how full they felt versus the actual caloric amount and or like literal placebo. There was one study where they gave people this like orange goop to eat and like some of the goop had calories and some of it didn't. Super weird, but the exercise performance was more so based on what they believed the goop was made of versus the
Yeah.
actual contents.
There was also, I know that Mind Pump talked about this study where they gave vegans, well, I think they gave vegans like protein and then they watched how their body like reacted to the protein versus
When they
like its
knew, yeah.
whole. Yeah, when they knew it and like your body has a different response for what you just your thought process with consuming food, which I think is absolutely wild.
Yeah. That could get me down the rabbit hole of how
I know.
like most pain is subjective too, but we won't do that today.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a good
Um,
throwback to that first interview we ever did on this show with Nick Licamelli, where we talked about that. So if you are
mhm,
interested in that
mhm.
topic, just go all the way back, literally all the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, man, we have quite a few, I feel like, actually to get through in only a few more minutes.
Let's do
You
a
want to do
part
one
two.
more?
Yeah, let's do
Yeah,
one
I
more
was
and
gonna
then a part
say,
two.
cool. So we have a couple different podcast episodes already on intermittent fasting. So if you want to go down the rabbit hole, who is Grant, right? With his,
Yeah, episode like
yeah.
11 or 12 or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, so really, really good ones. But basically, I think I still hear like I'm in a lot of Facebook groups for moms and a lot
It's
of them, how
really
do I
popular.
it's so popular, intermittent fasting. So basically, and the other thing too, that like there's so many different ways that you can do intermittent fasting. Like some people have very specific windows of eating where it's like I can only eat between 12 and 5, or I just try to fast as long as I can in the morning, or whatever it is. Basically, the idea is that you're just shortening your window of eating throughout the day.
Yeah.
And so it has gained a lot of popularity because it's this idea that like, well, if I shorten my window, I can't eat as much. So therefore, it's going to help with weight management and I'm going to lose weight. Which if it works for some people and they can keep the weight off, then by all means, like go for it. But if you're like struggling going through the day and you can't feel like you can't eat anything until like 1 or 2 in the afternoon and you're just
Yeah.
like struggling, it's like, is it really worth it?
Yeah, I think it with intermittent fasting specifically, it's really just about going in with your eyes wide open because it is truly just a mechanism to make adhering to a calorie deficit easier. So you have less calories, you have less opportunities to eat. It's a little bit more black and white of like, these are the times that I can and I can't. And if it makes it easier on your mental load to just like know that and think like, I can't eat at this time versus I can eat at this time, that can be a very, very helpful tool and heuristic to where like some people may spend their entire day worried about what should I eat next? What should I eat next? Should I eat now? Should I eat later? But it is not magical in the sense that shortening your eating window does not actually produce any other results other than making it easier for you to adhere to a calorie deficit. And I was going to kind of say, like, at this point, with all the things we've talked about how calories in versus calories out every 24-hour period. And just on average across the week, if you stay in that deficit, you will see the results that you're looking for. So intermittent fasting is no different. If I were to completely overeat every time I hit my window, I would gain weight. But it just is really hard to eat a whole day's worth of food in one or two sittings. That's
Yeah.
really the magic of it, quote unquote. Um, but flip side, there has been evidence to support slightly shortening your eating window, which I found has been interesting. And I think just like anything, it's like we go from one extreme of like any time of day to the other extreme of like shortest window possible to something in the middle. And there's actually been a lot of good research to support circadian eating rhythms, meaning that if you're eating primarily when the sun is actually out and following something that's a little bit like we're just and again this lends itself to okay the carbs before bed people are going to come back out of the woodwork and we're going to have those things pop back up again, but the idea is that it's just more in congruence with like our body's natural rhythm. And for people who really struggle with metabolic syndrome or tendencies towards like high blood sugar, pre-diabetes, this can be a helpful strategy, but not without calories in versus calories out first, adherence first, and fitting your lifestyle first. So if you're just not somebody who can eat in that, maybe 12-hour window or 14-hour window instead of 16 to 20, if that just doesn't work with your schedule, you have to go with what fits your schedule first. But if you are in a place where you can optimize those little details, that can actually help a little bit with things like insulin sensitivity for people who do have a lot of weight to lose and struggle with their blood sugar a lot. So I learned that recently.
Yeah. And I think the same thing too. It's like, I mean, because and I know you have too, but like I've absolutely have used intermittent fasting when I'm in a dieting phase where I'm like, I
Yeah.
prolong my first meal and I try to have a cutoff. And like, it just, like you said, it just kind of helps a little bit with like, being more adherent. But also if you're like, if this is something, you also have to think about like, is this something I'm going to follow the rest of my life?
Yeah.
Because like if you are like, well, I can't have coffee dates anymore, and I guess I can't do brunch, or I guess I can't do like if it's starting
Yeah.
to affect your overall lifestyle and you don't like it and you're not like living a fulfilling life, like that's something I would be like, okay, it's a tool, and like also to just like use it when you can, but also just to be a little bit flexible with it too, because I don't want you
Yeah.
missing out on things.
Or just like knowing what the flip side, like let's say it's like if I do this for the rest of my life, what are the consequences? But like let's say I do use this as a tool for my fat loss phase. What is it going to look like when I'm out of my fat loss phase? And just having a
Mhm.
plan for that, right? So like let's say I have this specific eating window in my fat loss phase. I can't just go back to nothing afterwards, but maybe I can find some sort of middle ground or like you said, some balance, some flexibility or moderation with it in my quote unquote maintenance phase that is livable, right? So we can do things that are slightly unsustainable for a temporary period of time to reach a goal. But if we don't have kind of that stepping stone back for the maintenance period, that's where the real trouble is. So I think it's just going in with your eyes wide open. Like you just have to know like why does something work, quote unquote work. And if you know that, then you can reverse engineer what needs to happen for you to keep those results long term and ask yourself, is that feasible? And that
Yeah.
can be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. All right, guys. Well, we'll wrap it up there. We've got a couple more that we can do for a part two.
Yeah,
It'd be really cool though if you did have anything that you've ever wondered about and you've been thinking and you want us to go ahead and bust a myth or
I would
break out
love
some
to.
research. Yeah, definitely shoot us over DMs, either myself or Marissa or our the Instagram account we have for the podcast. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode and looking forward to part two. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.